We've now got some styling on our application, and it's looking pretty good, but there's just one thing that's kind of awkward about it. Remember, as I'm refreshing the page, my location is instantly detected because I have done an override on my geolocation. But we need to think about the first time user experience. Like the first time a user loads up our app, and they might be sitting there waiting for the location to be detected. And while they're waiting for that, well, this page might not quite look so pretty. Let me show you what I mean. I'm going to go ahead and reset my location preferences right here, and then I'll refresh the page. Now, just as before, when the page is first loading up and we're waiting to get our geolocation, we see this very white background with this kind of ugly text up here that just says loading. When I finally click allow, well, then it turns into something kind of nice. So I think that in order to make this page a little bit more user-friendly than it is right now, we should really try to get some type of better interface here when the page is still loading up. So let's kind of brainstorm here a little bit. I want you to flip over, if you still have this open, to the semantic UI documentation. And then once inside of here, I'm going to look on the left-hand menu. I'm going to go down to Loader right here, underneath the Elements section. So on the Loader, we can put essentially a nice spinning icon with a black background and some text to tell the user that, hey, we're like trying to do something here. I think that doing a full screen loading animation like this would be a lot more appropriate than just showing that white loading text up there while we wait for the approval to get the user's location. So let's try putting this together. Now, before writing any code for this, I want you to think about where we're going to place this spinner thing inside of our application. Really quickly, if you want to, you can click on that little code icon right there, and it'll show you the HTML, or for our case, JSX, that we have to write out to get that effect. Without a doubt, if we wanted to stick that into our render method of our app component, it would mean that we would not be able to reuse that spinner in other locations inside of our application. Now, at this point, our app is pretty simple, very straightforward, but whenever we're putting together a React application, as much as possible, we want to at least try to make reusable components. So all I'm trying to say here is that I think that rather than just sticking in some raw JSX right here for when we are in the case of loading, I think that we should instead create a separate component whose sole purpose will be to show a spinner like this on the screen. So let's give it a go. I'm going to look for my src directory, and inside there I'll make a new file called spinner.js. I'm calling this spinner simply because this thing kind of spins right here. You could call it a loader, whatever you want it to be. I'm just going to call it a spinner. I think that's a reasonable name for the component. So then inside of here, I'm going to import React from React. I'll make my spinner functional component. And for right now, I'll put in all the elements right here that are required to get this thing to show up on the screen. So I'm going to have not the UI segment. We don't actually need that for what you and I are doing. All we need is the div with class name UI active dimmer, and then this loading thing inside of it. So I'm going to put a div with a class name of UI active dimmer. And inside of it, I'll put another div with the class name of UI big text loader, like so. And then inside there, I'll put some text like loading for right now. And then at the bottom of the file, finally, I'll put my export default spinner to make sure that this component is available in other locations inside my project. So now we've got a reusable spinner that we can use in many locations. And if we even start a new project in the future, we could easily come and just copy paste this thing and use it in a new project. So that's the benefit to trying to make new components as opposed to just stuffing more JSX into your existing components. So I'm going to now flip back over to my index.js file. I'm going to import spinner from spinner at the top, and then I'll make use of that spinner inside of my render method. So rather than the hard-coded loading right here, I'm going to replace that thing with a spinner instead. All right, so let's now save this. We'll flip back over to the browser and see how it looks. Perfect. That is so much better than what we had before. So now it is way more clear to our user that we are waiting on something before we can show them any content. When we then click on allow or block right here, it actually resolves to some interesting screen. And the nature or the relationship between these two screens is way more clear than what we had before. I would argue that before, when we had that like tiny little loading text on the top left-hand side, and then we eventually resolved it to this big orange screen, that would probably be a very jarring experience for the user. But showing that loading page, which is a full screen dark thing like this, kind of makes that big transition a little bit less abrupt. Okay, so this looks pretty good. Now, one last thing I want to mention here. You'll notice that our text right here is hard-coded to say loading. Now that's just a tad bit unclear to our user. When we say loading, the user might think, oh, like they're loading something, like they're making a network request or they're fetching some data. And it's not really clear that in fact, we are waiting for the user to either allow or block our location request. So I think that the last thing we need to do is somehow have the ability to customize our spinner and change the message that it shows. Because in this case, I want to show something more like, hey, please select or please allow us to read your location. And then it would be more clear to the user that, oh, I need to do something before this page is going to actually load up. So let's come back to the next section, and we're going to start to customize our spinner component just a little bit to make sure that we can show some different text inside of here besides loading.